This is, of course, the blunted version for training and not killing your opponent, so that you can then train again, which is very nice. The scabbard, I have it currently in a sword belt, also from Kult of Athena. That is a close-up there. So basically, on to what actually the sword is. And functionally, it's really just a standard sort of Norman sword as far as I can tell. Of course, the classic Norman sword would usually have a straight across crossguard, but this is fine too. So that's part of why the blade really sort of looks almost like a Viking sword with just a little bit more of a taper to it. And it still has that very wide sort of Viking style fuller. It's almost even too wide to even call it a fuller at this point, which is kind of interesting. So it really fits in that sort of Norman aesthetic. But that said, there's no reason you couldn't use this throughout the Middle Ages as well. That's perfectly reasonable. It's got that classic sort of Western or European style handle, where what I mean by that is, as you look, it's smaller here and it gets wider towards the tip, and it's towards the crossguard. And honestly, the crossguard, right underneath the crossguard, is possibly even the widest point of the handle. It is nice and oval, and it has just a hint of a swell around the middle, which is nice. Personally, my preference is to have a bit more of a swell here and then actually tapering under the crossguard, because I enjoy having some play like this. So you have some play like that and you still have a good grip, but that's not necessarily actually correct. That's just my personal preference. These were really meant to be sort of gripped nice and firm like that, just nice and good. And if you really needed to do some point play, you could do that, but this isn't a point oriented sword, right? This is, of course, circular blunted so that you can reenact with it and not be in danger of stabbing somebody, but it actually wouldn't be all that much more pointed than that. It would come up here and then it would taper in rather sharply to a point. So it's not really stabbing being the main sort of thing. It's very much a chopping and hacking sort of sword, which is very reminiscent of the Viking sort of swords. You know, a little bit of this has, of course, always a little bit of speculation involved with this, even in a very historical sense. There's always a little bit of speculation. My personal speculation is that part of the idea is if you're fighting against chainmail or against really good padded armor, where you're probably not going to cut through it with this sort of sword, just a good old smack, you know, like hitting him with a baseball bat. You know, it's a reasonably heavy sword. As far as I'm aware, this is the normal weight for this sort of sword. Whatever that's listed on the website, I'm sure you don't need to. I don't need to try to remember it super hard and look it all up and interrupt the video and everything. But this would very much hurt, even with some good padding and some good chainmail, especially if you get them in the head. And historically, we know that was sort of one of the big moves, was come over, smack them right on the head, sort of a downward chop with these guys. So the blunt force could be a serious issue with this type of sword, because it's so fat and it's so sturdy, and that's kind of interesting. Some of the later swords are very much about the point, and you deal with chainmail by stabbing in between the links. But this is too fat of a tip for that to be really efficient. So that's what we're looking at what sort of a sword this actually is. Oh, and one more thing, just because I think it's so interesting. This type of sword, when you see this type of crossguard, you know it's post-Viking, because it has this longer crossguard and this longer pommel coming down, and a full circular pommel. A Viking pommel, of course, is a bit wider and a bit closer in under the hand, and a half circle shape, and then the cross guard is much closer in. And really, the going theory, at least as I understand it, and of course there's always new understandings coming to light, so this could become outdated shortly, or I could even have an outdated idea myself, but it makes sense to me, is that this is really that close-in type that the Vikings used was really to get around their own shield without interfering with their own fist. Because I don't have a big Viking shield with me, so we're going to use this hat and we're going to pretend it's humongous and made out of wood. But if we're cutting around, you could hit your own edge of your shield with this, and that would really interrupt your strike, and that could happen on the inside as well. And if you need to suddenly cycle down and come around and do something there, you could also interfere with yourself with your own guard. And in large part, that's because with a Viking shield, it's a center grip, so I'd hold it, I would hold the shield in the middle. And so that means that if you think about it, half of the shield is sticking forward from your hand, right? So half of it is going back towards my arm this way, and half of it is coming out from my hand forwards. So there's a lot going this way, and that's really useful for a Viking shield. You can strike very effectively forwards with that, try to tip their shield in, making all sorts of interesting plays with that. But it also means that you have to be very careful with how you design the hand part of your sword to be able to fit around such a large center grip shield, which I think is really fascinating. It's not because they were less like technologically sword savvy that the cross guard was shorter and the pommel was closer in under the hand. That's not it at all. It's because the shield was different, and I think in a large part that's because Vikings didn't typically ride horses into battle. They might ride them to the battle, but then they would get off of the horse to fight because the horses, as I understand it, weren't necessarily big enough or plentiful enough to be risked in battle. It wasn't that sort of, the horsemanship technology wasn't quite there to be used in battle, and as such, center grip shields are very popular. If you're on a horse, a center grip shield will not really work because it'll bump into the neck of the horse, and you just freaking can't ride a horse like that. So if you have a shield that's strapped on and it comes up like this, well, then you can ride the horse much better. You can grip the reins with your hand, whereas you could not with a center grip shield because you need to hold on to the shield at that one point. And when it's like that, all of a sudden all this coverage that was over towards your right side of your body has moved to the left, and the shield might even be smaller. And as a result, you might need a larger cross guard, or at the very least be able to make use of a larger cross guard in your right hand. So then that's part of why we see these come along. And I think also there's definitely a lot to be said about the armor becoming more prevalent. There's more steel available the longer forward you go, just by the nature of there's been more time to dig it up, more time to develop technologies about digging it up and building upon what's already there, and so on. And as a result, you could have armor that goes down your arms and your legs and be much more effective that way. And you could actually have a smaller shield and still be fine. And therefore, and that's a trend we see from the Dark Ages all the way up through to the end of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. It's a very slow trend, but it is there, of shields getting a little bit smaller and eventually sort of disappearing when people get more and more armor, and we get longer, more tapered swords to deal with things like chainmail and stabbing in. So that's where this sword sort of sits in all of that. And I realize that may not have been why you clicked on the video, so I guess I'll have to add like a link to the more reviewy part of the review. But anyways, the actual sword itself is very nice. This is nice and solid. There's no give. There's no rotation anywhere in here, which is of course expected, but I've gotten some cheap swords in the past, and I've found some of that to happen, and it's no good. So you don't want that. And of course, this one doesn't have it, which is great. Now, in the grand scheme of things, this is a cheap sword for solidly built Western style swords. It is, and the price point was a little bit tough to swallow for me, coming from Eastern style swords, which are not meant, or which are usually built not to hit things. This was, even though it's a training sword, it's blunt, they still built it to like be able to hit stuff, and that's part of why it's so much more expensive. It's very nicely built. I think there's also an economy of scale coming in there. You know, China is very big and it's full of a lot of people, and they may not have the same regulations on working on these things as we do in the US or European places where they manufacture the sword. I actually don't know where this one is manufactured, but they did a good job wherever they did it. And in China, you know, since there's so many more people, and you only you need a certain amount to sort of hit that economy of scale, even if the same percentage of people or a smaller percentage of people are into swords and that sort of thing, because there's such a larger base of just people in general, then you can hit that economy of scale faster. So I think that also has something to do with the price difference here. But again, even if they're made very nicely and have the same quality of fit and finish as this sword does, they're not usually meant to actually smack into something. So I guess all of that is sort of to say that if you're sort of taken aback by the price of some of these swords, it is sort of normal in the grand scheme of things, and it is worth it. This is absolutely a good deal for the price, in my opinion. Now, yeah, you could smack something with this. I haven't done that because I don't want to mess up the, like, you know, if you actually hit something, no matter how nice the sword is, there's always a little chance you're going to get a little ding or a little whatever, you know, that's normal. That's not the sword being bad, that's just like you smacked it into something, you know, what did you expect? So I'm not going to do that too much with this one, and I don't have any good targets to do it against if I wanted to. So just for your fullest information, I have not brutally tested this against a hard target, but I feel like it would hold up very well if I did. So now onto some of the like balance and weight and that sort of thing. So these types of swords, as I've said, are a little bit more of the smacking brute force type. You're going to come in and you're going to hit very hard, and so even if it doesn't cut through something, it could do a lot of bashing damage. The balance on this is somewhere in here. Now the balance is listed quite accurately on Kult of Athena, as I recall it. It is quite accurate, but that's not, you know, seeing it listed isn't always the same as seeing how it actually looks on the sword. So this is, my finger's maybe just a little far down the sword. Yeah, that's right where that balance is, and that's pretty normal as far as I'm aware. So they've done a lot of things right. Now, this is not a really fast, agile sword as I would consider it, but it is sort of in the middle, which is to be expected. So you can definitely move around, but you're not gonna, like, trying to do little quick movements like this, it's very difficult. And of course you have your shield for doing that, that's not the point, but it's not a really like agile, like precise sword. So to give you an example of what I would consider a really agile, precise sword, we have something like this. This is very light. You can probably see just by the way I'm holding it, it doesn't have that same weight. And it's very thin. When you get to the edge, it practically disappears. And this has a concave shape there, so it's really meant for cutting. You know, one of the big moves, this is like similar to a dueling, sort of rapier dueling type, or saber dueling type thing, where you might cut just with that little edge there, just boom, cut the wrist, cut some light open target. This style of sword actually is more prevalent after gunpowder exists, but this is a light sword is the point. So when I'm doing some of these moves with it, you can really see you can move much faster. And of course, now this one might actually be too springy, but it's, again, not meant to actually hit anything, so I can't complain too much there, really. But that's, hopefully that actually looks like a bit of a difference. It actually expends a lot less energy to do even those same sort of motions with this sword as it does with this guy. So, so there you go. So that's where this sort of fits in the world of swords. It's of course a lot less heavy than something like a, any sort of two-handed sword, or I know this actually looks like a very long handle, but actually with this type of sword, you don't hold it right up here. You hold it a little bit down so you can get a bit more play like this and keep a good grip as you do. That's a side note, but yeah, not super heavy, not super light either, right in the middle. One quick note on the construction here is, one thing I like to do is, if you hit the bottom of the sword, I don't know how well that's showing up on camera, but it's got a nice vibration that travels all the way through the sword. That means everything's functioning like one piece, and there's a nice flex to the blade. That means it's not going to break or bend immediately when it encounters some sort of resistance. So that's a nice, good thing that we do want to see. That's a little side note there. And when you thrust really hard, you'll see that too. I don't know how well that's going to come out on camera there. But when you thrust and it comes to a really hard stop, the blade will also shiver a little bit because of such a fast change in trajectory. And that's, to me, that is a sign of a very well put together blade. This does have sort of a modern looking maker's mark on it. So if that's going to bother you, you should know that it exists. It's completely reasonable that a maker's mark could be put there, and they would have the technology to like stamp it in or whatever, but it is very, very precise. So it's a little bit more, you might have to suspend your disbelief a little bit there. There's a little tiny bit of space between the crossguard and the sword. It's not something I would worry about, and especially at this price point, they did a very good job. So, and like I said, it feels really solid, so I wouldn't worry about that. And it's really, like, it's very minor. It's a very minor thing that exists there. Now, on to some of my actual complaints about this sword, which are primarily very minor, but they do exist, so I want to cover them. The handle, the shape, as I've said before, is pretty normal. It's sort of the correct shape, but it really does make your hand sort of want to go right up to the edge here, which, as I understand it, is totally normal. But we have a little bit of just a sharp enough edge on this that it will wear on the skin at the top of your hand here. So you either have to grip it down here a little bit more, which, given the shape of the handle, takes more effort than it would with a more elliptical shape on the handle. But so it will want to dig in there. So of course you're like, well, you're supposed to wear it with a glove, right? And, I know in like the Bayeux tapestry, they weren't usually depicted wearing gloves, as far as I recall. But I think, generally speaking, it's normal to wear gloves. I think in writing, they were usually wearing gloves. So for whatever that's worth, wear gloves if you want to, or not if you want to. If I'm going to be on a battlefield, I'm probably going to wear a glove. So yeah, so you can definitely wear a glove. There's definitely room on the handle to accommodate an even larger, more gauntlet-like glove than mine here. Unfortunately, the fit of this glove is not perfect. You know, they were pretty cheap gloves, but they are still made out of a nice material. It's a grippy material, which is part of why I like them, part of why it's good for this. But here's the thing. It's very easy for it to, I'm not doing a good job of showing, but it's very slick when you're wearing a glove. This handle material is very smooth that they've covered it with. There is ribbing in there, but that mostly helps when you're holding the sword barehanded. So if I thrust really good, let's see if I can get that on camera better, like it wants to do that. And I'm hitting the pommel, which is great because it's not going to leave my hand, but it shouldn't move that much. And I'm gripping this with a normal grip strength for a sword, which means that if I really want to hold on to it and not let it leave my hand, I have to basically go to death grip level of grip in order to have the same amount of traction as a normal grip on a sword if I'm wearing a glove. So that's my main complaint, is that some parts of the handle are really made with gloves in mind, and other parts are really made with a bare hand in mind. And this handle material feels absolutely lovely with a bare hand. I really like the way it feels. But I think I might run into a little bit of trouble if I was doing a long sort of reenactment or a LARP or sparring or something like that, you know, where it would cut into the top of my hand, or my hand would get extremely tired from having to grip extra hard through the glove. The glove and the handle should help you hold the sword better, not worse. So that's a complaint that I have there. And I think you know, this is sort of a budget range sword, so a lot of complaints that I might there are a lot of complaints that I might not make towards a budget sword that I would make towards a larger sword. I mean, not that there are any about this sword in particular, but in a lot of cases you might be thinking like, well, does it really matter at this budget point? And I think yes, because they could just use a slightly more grippy material, or a slightly wider, larger tooth on the ribbing or something, and not change the price point at all. I think that on their end, the cost of manufacturing would be the same with just a slightly different design. So I do think it's a valid complaint still, even when this is a budget sort of item. The other super minor complaint that's not even really a real complaint is with the scabbard. It's not a really solid fit in there. I feel like with just a little bit of weight, it will come right out. Not a big deal, not a problem, but you know, overall scabbard's very nice. Wood scabbard, leather coating, very basic, but very well executed, and that's exactly what you want in this type of sword. And one other thing that, just because I think it's so neat, this is not a hand and a half sword, as I'm sure you can tell. There's no room to put another hand, except you can grip it by the pommel. And if I've learned one thing about arming and armor and all of that stuff, it's that nothing happens by accident. I really don't think it's an accident that this is so comfortable and so easy to grip. Granted, you'd normally always be wielding a shield, but there's definitely points where you might not be in a battlefield situation and you'd have your sword with you, but it's completely impractical to bring a shield with you. So being able to grip it by the pommel allows you to have a lot of control just from that bottom hand. I can really hang on to it very well. I wouldn't want to, but you could do some sort of sneaky, cool movie thing. I don't know. But the fact that you could do two hands with it is very nice. I may not look comfortable. It feels extremely comfortable. I've seen large swords that basically have this exact shape, just sort of smoothly built in to the upper part of the pommel up here, or excuse me, the grippy sword part up here, where you can get a lot of control out of even a very heavy sword that you wouldn't normally have the same level of control from. And I think that's very cool. And I love the idea of being able to get a little bit more play, especially on the backswing, because you can come back by pushing. This is a very natural, very easy way to push with your backhand there, whereas it might be harder with the front hand, and you can get some very, very cool effects with that. So overall, I would give this a solid 9 out of 10. If I had to go down to a 5-star rating, I'd have to give it 5 out of 5 stars because it's just very comfortable, very nice. It'll come oiled. It has a little bit of a mineral smell to it. I'm definitely going to switch out to a lighter oil just for that reason. But yeah, overall, I highly recommend you get this sword if you're looking for a basic, solid arming sword and you don't want one that's sharp and you don't want to break the bank. This is a great sword for that. Thank you for watching.